My name is Simone Vreeland. I am 38 years old. 3 years ago, on a Saturday afternoon in September, 41 women sat in my sister's living room surrounded by yellow balloons and paper flower garlands, and the specific cheerful abundance of a baby shower that my sister Claire had spent 6 weeks planning. And my mother-in-law Patricia stood up from her chair near the window and said, in a voice that she had clearly decided did not need to be lowered, because she had decided that what she was about to say was simply the truth, and the truth did not require quiet delivery, that her son had been manipulated into this pregnancy by a woman who had seen an opportunity and taken it, and that everyone in that room who actually cared about Marcus deserved to know that before they spent any more time celebrating. 41 women, my sister, my mother, 3 of my closest friends who had driven from different cities specifically for this afternoon, my colleagues, my neighbors, my cousin who was 8 months pregnant herself and had driven 3 hours from Pittsburgh. Patricia said it, and then she sat back down, the specific composed sitting down of someone who has delivered a prepared statement and is now waiting for the room to process it. The room did not make a sound for what I estimate was approximately 8 seconds, which is a very long time for a room containing 41 women and a table of food and yellow balloons. I was sitting in the chair that had been designated mine for the afternoon, the specific decorated chair that baby showers produce, with a ribbon bow tied to the back and a small sign that said, Mama, in gold letters, holding a cup of the specific pink punch my sister had made from a recipe she had found 3 weeks earlier and practiced twice. And I looked at my mother-in-law across the room and I understood, with the specific clarity that arrives in moments of extreme shock, that this was not the beginning of something. This was the visible surface of something that had been building for the entire 2 years of my marriage to her son, building in the specific way of things that grow underground and then arrive at the surface fully formed, requiring no further development once they emerge. What Patricia did not know, sitting in her chair near the window with 41 women processing her statement around her, was that the child I was carrying, the child whose arrival she had just publicly characterized as the product of manipulation, was going to become, 3 years later, the specific instrument through which the full truth of what our family had been through, and what I had done and who I actually was, would finally become visible to her in a way that no amount of words, across 2 years of trying, had managed to make visible. She did not know any of that in September. She found out in December, 3 years later, in a courtroom in Cook County, Illinois, when the judge called the case and I walked in and sat down at the table directly across from her. Before I tell you what happened in that courtroom, please take a moment to like and subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you are watching from and what time it is there. I read every single one. Now let me take you all the way back. Not to the baby shower, not to the courtroom. Back to the beginning, the place where I first understood what kind of family I had married into, and what that was going to require of me for as long as I intended to stay in it. I grew up in Evanston, Illinois, the older of 2 daughters born to my parents, James and Dorothy Vreeland, who had met in graduate school at Northwestern, married the month after they both completed their degrees, and built a life together in the specific, deliberate way of 2 people who had been raised to understand that life required active construction rather than passive occupation. My father taught sociology at Northwestern for 31 years. My mother ran her own occupational therapy practice for 28 years, retiring 2 years ago with what she described as the specific satisfaction of someone who had done exactly the work they were built for, and had done it long enough to see its results compound across decades. I was raised, in that household, with a specific set of values that I want to describe carefully because they are central to understanding everything that follows. My parents believed, and transmitted this belief consistently and without drama across the entirety of my childhood, that the most important thing a person could do was see the people in front of them clearly, without the distortion of what you needed them to be or what was convenient for them to be, but what they actually were, in their specific complexity and their specific humanity. My father called this the sociological imagination applied personally, the ability to understand individual behavior within its full social and historical context, rather than reducing it to simple moral categories. I am telling you this because it shaped, in ways I did not always recognize as it was happening, how I responded to the situation I found myself inside when I married Marcus Holloway. I met Marcus at a fundraiser for a literacy nonprofit in Chicago. The specific environment of a Chicago nonprofit event in the fall, warm rooms and good wine, and the particular quality of conversation that occurs when a group of people who care about something specific gather to express that caring through attendance and checkbooks. I was 31. He was 34. He was tall and thoughtful and asked questions with the specific genuine curiosity of someone who actually wanted the answers, rather than using questions as a conversational mechanism to fill space before saying what he himself wanted to say. We talked for 2 hours at that fundraiser. We had dinner the following Thursday. We spent the following 6 months discovering, with increasing certainty, that we were the specific kind of compatible that does not require performance to sustain. The compatibility of two people who are genuinely interested in each other's inner lives, rather than simply comfortable in each other's company. Marcus was the younger of 2 children born to his parents, Gerald and Patricia Holloway, in a suburb of Chicago called Deerfield. His father, Gerald, was a retired commercial real estate attorney who had spent 30 years building a substantial practice and a corresponding reputation in the specific social world of successful North Shore professionals. His mother, Patricia, had not worked outside the home since Marcus was born. The specific choice of a woman who had decided that the management of her household and the raising of her children was the work she intended to do, and who had done it with the focused intensity of someone who brings professional standards to whatever domain they choose to occupy. Patricia Holloway was, and I want to say this with the care it requires, a woman whose love for her children was genuine and total, and expressed through a form of control so complete and so long practiced that she had long since stopped distinguishing between the control and the love, experiencing them as the same thing, the natural and appropriate expression of a maternal devotion that she believed was simply doing what good mothers do. She had for 34 years been the primary organizing intelligence of Marcus's life, his schedule, his social world, his preferences, his sense of himself. Not in the specific dramatic way of obviously controlling parents. In the specific invisible way of mothers whose children have never known a version of themselves that existed outside the frame she provided, and who therefore do not know to miss what they have never had access to. I understood this about Patricia, imperfectly and gradually, across the 6 months of dating Marcus before I met her. I met her fully, the first time, at a Sunday dinner at the Holloway house in Deerfield, 8 months into my relationship with Marcus, and I want to describe that dinner carefully because the seeds of everything that followed were visible in it. For anyone paying the specific kind of attention my father's sociology training had taught me to pay. The Holloway house was a 5-bedroom colonial on a tree-lined street in Deerfield, with a kitchen that had been renovated 3 times across the 30 years they had lived there, and a dining room that seated 12 comfortably, and that Patricia used for Sunday dinners with a frequency and attention to detail that communicated, clearly to anyone who understood such communications, that Sunday dinner at the Holloway table was not a casual meal, but a specific institution with its own protocols and expectations. Patricia met me at the door with the specific warmth of a woman performing welcome, while simultaneously conducting a thorough assessment. She was 63 at that time, slim and precisely maintained, with the particular quality of someone who has always understood that physical presentation was a form of communication, and had been communicating carefully through it for 6 decades. She held my hand in both of hers when she greeted me. The gesture of warmth, and her eyes moved across my face and my clothes, and the specific way I stood with the focused, rapid assessment of a woman who had spent 34 years protecting her son from inputs she had not personally approved. Gerald was warmer in a more uncomplicated way, the specific warmth of a man who had spent 30 years in commercial real estate negotiating with strangers, and had developed, through long practice, a genuine ability to put people at ease in initial encounters, an ability entirely separate from what he actually thought of them, and whether his assessment would change over time. Marcus's sister Diane was there, 2 years older than Marcus, married to a man named Jeff who worked in finance, with 2 children under 5 who occupied the specific, exhausting center of attention that young children occupy at family gatherings. Diane was pleasant to me in the measured way of a sibling assessing a new partner for their brother, the specific calibrated warmth of someone who has not yet decided what she thinks, but is reserving judgment in a manner that feels almost like welcome even though it is not quite. The dinner itself was excellent. Patricia was a serious cook in the specific way that women of her generation and background sometimes are, having channeled genuine intelligence and attention into the management of a household in an era when this was still understood as a respectable primary occupation, and her table reflected decades of practice and genuine skill. I want to describe what happened during the dinner, not as a series of specific offenses, but as a texture, because I think texture is more accurate than incident for what I observed. Patricia asked me questions about my work throughout the dinner. I am a social worker, specifically a clinical social worker, who works with children in foster care and the child welfare system, work that I have been doing for 12 years, and that I am, quietly and completely, devoted to. I answered her questions with the specific, genuine engagement that I bring to talking about work I believe in. Patricia listened to my answers with the specific quality of attention that is not actually attention but assessment, the difference being that attention receives what is being said, while assessment is using what is being said as data for a conclusion already being formed. At one point, discussing a specific case I described in general terms, Patricia said, "That sounds like very difficult work, very emotionally heavy. I imagine it's hard not to bring it home with you." I said that it was sometimes, and that I had spent years developing practices for managing the specific emotional weight of working in child welfare without allowing it to deplete me. She nodded in a way that communicated something that I filed and did not address in that first dinner. What she was communicating, I understood later, was, "Your work is a liability." The specific calculation of a woman assessing a potential daughter-in-law and identifying the ways in which that person's professional life might complicate the image she had of her son's future household. Marcus, across the dinner table, was himself in a way that I had come to understand as his particular negotiated self in his family's presence. Warm and engaged, but with a specific quality of reduced dimensionality, as though the version of himself that existed at his parents' table had fewer layers than the version I knew in the other contexts of his life. Not false, just smaller. The way some plants grow toward available light and the available light in the Holloway dining room was directed primarily by Patricia. I filed this also. I drove home that evening and sat in my apartment and thought carefully about everything I had observed, and I made, in the quiet of my own thinking, a specific decision that shaped how I approached the following 2 years. I was going to be patient. I was going to be consistent. I was going to be genuinely myself in Patricia's presence rather than performing a version of myself calibrated to address her concerns, because I had learned, in 12 years of clinical social work, that people who are performing for an anxious audience feed the anxiety rather than resolving it, and that the only thing that actually resolves deep-seated maternal anxiety about a son's partner is sufficient time in that partner's actual presence to develop an independent assessment. This was, I want to be honest, a strategy that required more patience and more sustained equanimity than I sometimes felt, across the 2 years between that first dinner and the baby shower. But it was the strategy I chose, and I maintained it because I believed it was right. Marcus and I were married 14 months after we met, at a ceremony in Evanston that my parents helped plan and that Patricia managed to be present at with the specific quality of someone attending an event they have reservations about, but have decided to attend graciously because the alternative, non-attendance, would cost them more than the discomfort of being there. Her toast at the reception was warm on the surface and carried underneath a specific current that I want to describe accurately. She said she hoped Marcus had found what he was looking for. She said she hoped the two of us would build a life that made both our families proud. She said she knew Marcus was going to be a wonderful husband because he had been raised to understand what devotion looked like. She did not say anything, in the toast, specifically about me. She expressed hope about the marriage while speaking almost entirely about Marcus. This absence, the specific missing element of genuine welcome for me rather than careful wishes for the institution, was noticed by my mother, who mentioned it to me quietly later that evening, and by my sister Claire, who said nothing during the evening but brought it up 2 weeks later when we were alone. I noticed it also. I said nothing to Marcus about it that night because our wedding night was not the night for that conversation, and I said nothing about it for several months afterward because I was still operating on the strategy of patience and consistency, still believing that time and genuine presence would eventually produce a more accurate picture in Patricia's assessment. I was not yet understanding the specific depth of what I was working against. I became pregnant 14 months into our marriage, on purpose, in the specific way of two people who have discussed having children thoroughly and have decided with mutual and considered intention that they are ready and that the time is right. Marcus and I had talked about children extensively across our relationship, the specific serious conversations that I think every couple owes themselves before making decisions that compound every other element of their lives. We both wanted children. We had discussed what kind of parents we hoped to be, what values we wanted to transmit, what our respective childhoods had given us that we wanted to preserve, and what they had given us that we wanted to do differently. I want to be completely specific about this because it matters enormously to what Patricia said at the baby shower. This pregnancy was planned, discussed, decided upon together, welcomed by both of us completely. It was not an accident. It was not a strategy. It was a decision made by two adults who wanted to become parents together. I told Marcus on a Thursday evening in July at our kitchen table, with a positive test on the table between us, and he held my face in both his hands and said something that I am going to keep private because it belongs to us, but that I will tell you was the specific words of a man who was genuinely entirely happy. We told his parents together, at a Sunday dinner 3 weeks later, when I was far enough along to feel reasonably confident sharing. Gerald stood and hugged me, the specific, genuine warmth of a grandfather-to-be discovering that identity for the first time. Patricia sat at the table for a moment before standing, and when she hugged me, the hug was brief, and the warmth in it had the quality of something assembled, rather than something felt. But I told myself it was surprise, or processing time, or simply Patricia's particular register of emotional expression, which had always been more controlled than spontaneous. I was not wrong about Patricia's controlled register. I was wrong about what was underneath the control. The 2 months between telling Patricia about the pregnancy and the baby shower were characterized by a specific pattern that I want to describe accurately, because I think it explains why September arrived the way it did. Patricia called Marcus during those 2 months, with increasing frequency and with the specific content of calls that Marcus, coming to find me after hanging up, reported with increasing discomfort. She had questions about our financial stability that she framed as maternal concern. She had concerns about my work schedule and whether I intended to take sufficient maternity leave. She had thoughts about our apartment, which she had decided was too small for a child despite never having been inside it. She had suggestions about neighborhoods we should consider moving to, suggestions that, I noticed, centered on neighborhoods close to Deerfield rather than neighborhoods convenient to either my workplace or Marcus's. Marcus relayed these conversations with the specific, weary apology of a man caught between two people he loves and who has not yet found the language or the courage to tell one of them to stop. He said she was just excited. He said she was just adjusting. He said she meant well. I said I believed she meant well, and that I needed him to understand that meaning well and doing well were different things and that the calls, in their current frequency and content, were something I needed him to address with her. He said he would. The frequency of the calls did not change. I made a decision during this period that I have examined many times since. I decided not to have the direct confrontation with Patricia that part of me felt was both warranted and necessary, because I understood, from my clinical training, that direct confrontation with someone in Patricia's specific psychological position, someone whose sense of herself was organized around being the primary organizing intelligence of her son's life, would produce not recalibration, but entrenchment. I decided to continue being patient, consistent, and genuinely myself, and to trust that time would do what arguments could not. This was the right strategy clinically. It was the strategy that ultimately produced the outcome this story arrives at. It was also, in the short term, the strategy that left me sitting in a decorated chair with a pink punch and gold letters that said, "Mama," when Patricia stood up near the window. I want to tell you about the baby shower in the specific detail it deserves, because I think the detail is what makes the full weight of what Patricia did comprehensible. My sister Claire had planned the shower across 6 weeks with the specific focused love of an older sister doing something significant for a younger sister she is deeply fond of. She had made handmade paper flowers, which took 3 evenings over 2 weeks. She had chosen the menu with reference to my specific food preferences during pregnancy, which she had cataloged through a series of casual-seeming questions across the preceding month. She had designed and printed the invitations herself. She had sourced the specific shade of yellow I had mentioned once in a conversation months earlier as my favorite. 41 women in that room. My mother, Dorothy, who had taken the day off specifically. 3 friends who had traveled. My cousin, 8 months pregnant herself. My colleagues from the child welfare office. The neighbors I had known for 7 years. Women who had come because they were genuinely happy about something happening in my life and wanted to be present for it. Patricia arrived at noon, 40 minutes before the shower was scheduled to begin, a timing I registered without comment, and that I understand now as Patricia establishing a foothold in the space before it filled, the specific positioning of someone who needed to feel in control of an environment before others arrived. Claire welcomed her warmly, because Claire is generous in a way that I have always admired, and because she had not yet had sufficient direct exposure to Patricia to have fully calibrated her welcome, though she had received an extensive briefing from me over the preceding months. The shower began at 1. The room was warm and genuinely joyful, in the specific way that baby showers for wanted pregnancies can be warm and joyful. The collective anticipation of a room full of women who love someone who is about to become a mother. I sat in my decorated chair and opened gifts and laughed at the right moments and felt, underneath the enjoyment of the occasion, the specific careful attention I had learned to maintain whenever Patricia was present in a room, monitoring the quality of her engagement without making it visible that I was monitoring anything. Patricia was quiet across the first hour. She sat near the window and ate her lunch and engaged in polite conversation with the women near her, and was, on the surface, simply a mother-in-law at her daughter-in-law's baby shower. At 2:15, approximately an hour and 15 minutes into the shower, there was a natural pause in the proceedings, a moment between the gift opening and the cake, when conversation distributed itself across the room in small clusters rather than centering on any single activity. Patricia stood up. I want to reconstruct what she said as precisely as I can, because precision serves this moment better than paraphrase. She said, standing near the window with the specific quality of someone who has been waiting for exactly this kind of unstructured moment. I think, before we continue, that there are some things that should be said. Some things that the people in this room who care about Marcus deserve to understand, since they've been celebrating without the full picture. The room went quiet with the specific speed of rooms that understand something is happening before they understand what it is. She said, Marcus is a wonderful man. He was raised to be responsible and devoted and to take his commitments seriously. And because he is that kind of man, when he found himself in a situation he hadn't entirely planned for, he did the right thing. He committed. He married. He is preparing to be a father. She paused. The pause was deliberate, the specific rhetorical pause of someone who understands that what follows a pause lands harder than what precedes it. She said, "But I think the women in this room who love Simone should also love her enough to be honest with her. And the women in this room who love Marcus should understand that there are people who saw an opportunity in a good man's kindness and took it." This pregnancy was not what Marcus would have chosen on this timeline, in this relationship, if he had been given the full space to make his own decision. I am his mother. I know my son. And I am telling you, because I believe the truth matters more than a pleasant afternoon, that this situation was arranged rather than chosen. She sat down. The room absorbed this for 8 seconds. 8 seconds of 41 women processing what they had just heard, while the paper flowers my sister had made over 3 evenings were still on the walls, and the punch was still in the bowl, and the specific cheerful abundance of a planned celebration was still arranged around the specific silence of a statement that had just entered it like something cold entering a warm room. I looked at my mother, Dorothy Vreeland, who had spent 28 years as an occupational therapist, who had raised 2 daughters on the specific principle of seeing people clearly, sat with an expression I had never seen on her face before and have not seen since, the expression of someone who has just witnessed something they are going to need considerable time to fully process before they trust themselves to respond to it. I looked at my sister Claire, who had made paper flowers and practiced the punch recipe twice, whose expression had moved through shock and fury and arrived at something harder and more specific that I recognized, knowing Claire as well as I do, as the expression she wears when she is deciding how to respond to something with maximum effectiveness rather than maximum heat. I looked at Patricia, sitting back near the window with the composed quality of someone who has said what they came to say. And then I did something that surprised, I believe, everyone in the room, including myself. I said in a voice that was, I want to be accurate, entirely steady, "Patricia, I'd like to respond to that, if I may." She looked at me. The look carried a specific quality of something I want to name carefully because I think it matters. It was not cruelty. It was the specific quality of someone who genuinely believes they are doing a necessary thing and is prepared to have that belief challenged. I said, "I am a clinical social worker. I have spent 12 years working with children and families in the most difficult circumstances the child welfare system encounters. In that work, I have learned a specific skill that I want to apply to this moment." I said, "The skill is the ability to separate what someone believes from what is actually true, and to do that separation with enough care that you don't have to be unkind about the gap between those two things." I said, "Patricia believes what she just said. I want to acknowledge that clearly and specifically rather than dismissing it. She is not lying. She is telling you what she believes about her son's marriage and about me." I said, "What she believes is not accurate. Marcus and I planned this pregnancy together. We discussed it across 6 months before we began trying. I can show anyone in this room the journal I kept during those conversations if that would be useful, which I do not think it will be, because what I am about to say matters more than documentation." I said, "The question this room should be asking is not whether I am telling the truth, though I am. The question is why a woman who has known me for 2 years, who has been present at my wedding and been to my home, and has every reason to know the specific kind of person I am and the specific kind of marriage her son and I have built, why this woman still believes what she just said." I let that sit for a moment. I said, "The answer to that question is complicated, and it is not mine to fully explain, because it is about Patricia's relationship to her son, and not about me. But I want the women in this room who love me to understand that I have known for 2 years that Patricia believes this, that I have chosen, across 2 years, to respond with patience rather than confrontation, because I believe that is the right way to build a relationship with a woman who is genuinely afraid of losing her son, which is what I believe is actually happening underneath what she just said." Patricia did not speak. I said, "We can continue the shower now." Claire made paper flowers and practiced the punch twice, and I would very much like to eat the cake she ordered. The room absorbed this. Then my mother said, quietly but completely audibly, "That's my daughter." And the room, gradually and then completely, returned to being a baby shower. Not the same baby shower that had existed before Patricia stood up. A different one. One that had passed through something and come out the other side of it still standing. Patricia stayed for another 40 minutes. She ate the cake. She spoke to the women near her in the specific composed manner of someone recalibrating without being willing to fully acknowledge the recalibration. She left before the final gifts were opened, saying she had another commitment, the specific graceful exit of someone who needs to leave but has not decided to acknowledge why. My sister waited until Patricia's car had pulled out of the driveway before she came, and put both arms around me from behind, her chin on my shoulder, and said, "I have never been more proud of you in my entire life." I held on to that. In the months that followed, I held on to it more times than I expected to need to. I want to tell you what happened between the baby shower in September and the courtroom in December 3 years later. Because those 3 years are the most important years in this story, and they cannot be summarized without losing the specific texture that makes the courtroom moment make sense. Our daughter was born in January, 5 weeks after the baby shower, on a Wednesday morning at 7:42, after a labor that began at 2 in the morning and proceeded with the specific focused intensity of a body doing the most serious work it is capable of doing. Marcus held my hand for 9 hours without once suggesting he needed to step away. He was, throughout those 9 hours, the most completely himself that I had seen him in any situation. All the careful, negotiated smallness that characterized his presence in his family's space entirely gone, replaced by a man I recognized as the person I had married, and who was now becoming, alongside me, a parent. We named her June Dorothy Holloway, the middle name for my mother. Patricia came to the hospital the following day. She held June for 14 minutes, which I timed without intending to, by the clock on the wall above the hospital bed. She said June was beautiful. She said she had her son's eyes. She looked at me over June's head with an expression I had not seen from her before, and have spent considerable time since trying to accurately name. It was not softening exactly. It was something more like the specific expression of someone encountering a fact that does not fit their existing framework and has not yet decided what to do about the fact. June was real. June was present. June was my daughter and Marcus's daughter, and she was in Patricia's arms, and the specific reality of her made Patricia's framework about how she had come to exist feel, I imagine, suddenly more complicated to maintain. I did not say anything. I let the 14 minutes be what they were. The following year was the year of ordinary new parenthood, which I want to describe as ordinary because I think the ordinariness matters. We were tired in the specific absolute way of new parents. We navigated the specific renegotiation of a partnership that a new child produces. We disagreed sometimes about specific things and resolved most of those disagreements through the particular honest directness that I think saved our marriage across its most difficult period. We took June to her appointments and watched her discover her hands and then her feet, and then the dog at my parents' house. And we were, in the texture of those ordinary days, deeply and genuinely happy. Patricia maintained a specific, careful distance across June's first year. She visited monthly, which was less frequently than I had expected given how close Deerfield was to Chicago, and during those visits she was warm with June and specifically careful with me, the particular carefulness of someone who has done something they cannot fully retract, and is now managing the aftermath through a combination of reduced intensity and studied pleasantness. Marcus had said something to her after the baby shower. He had not told me the specifics of what he had said for several months, and when he did tell me, I want to be honest that what he had said was less than I had hoped for, and more than I had expected. He had told Patricia that what she had done at the baby shower was not acceptable, and that she needed to understand that Simone was his wife and June's mother, and that any future behavior of that kind would have consequences for their relationship. He had not given her the full reckoning she deserved. He had given her a warning that she had received with sufficient seriousness to modify her behavior. I accepted this, not because it was fully adequate, but because I had spent enough time in the specific family dynamic to understand that Marcus was doing the thing that required the most courage he currently had available, and that demanding more than someone's current capacity produces resistance rather than growth. I want to be specific about this because I think it matters to understanding who Marcus is in this story. He was not a perfect advocate across these years. He was a man who loved his mother and loved his wife and found those two loves in genuine tension. And he navigated that tension with more honesty and more growth than many men in his position manage, even if the growth was sometimes slower than the situation required. I stayed patient. I stayed consistent. I stayed genuinely myself. The situation that ultimately produced the Courtroom December arrived in the second year of June's life, from a direction I had not anticipated. Marcus's sister Diane's marriage ended. Quietly and then not quietly, the specific trajectory of a marriage in serious distress that both people involved have been managing privately until the management fails. Diane and Jeff separated in February of June's second year, a separation that became, by June, a divorce proceeding, and that produced, across the intervening months, a custody dispute regarding their two children, now 6 and 4, that eventually required the formal involvement of the family court system in Cook County. I want to be careful about how I describe what followed because the children involved are real and young, and their situation deserves the specific respect of not being described in more detail than this story requires. What this story requires is this. In the context of the custody proceedings, the court ordered a home study and a guardian ad litem assessment to evaluate both parents' households and make recommendations about custody arrangements. The guardian ad litem assigned to Diane and Jeff's children was a clinical social worker named Robert Marsh, who worked for an organization I was familiar with through my own professional network. Robert Marsh, in the course of conducting the home study and assessment, encountered at the Holloway family home in Deerfield, where Diane had been temporarily residing during the separation, Patricia Holloway. He encountered, specifically, Patricia Holloway in the specific context of a grandmother who had been providing significant childcare support to Diane during the separation period, a context that required Robert Marsh to interact with Patricia in his professional capacity as guardian ad litem for the children. Robert Marsh, conducting his assessment, spoke with Patricia about the children's emotional environment and support systems. Patricia spoke to him about the family, about Diane, about the children, and, in the course of that conversation, about Marcus and about June. What she said about June, to a court-appointed guardian ad litem conducting a formal assessment, was what she had said to 41 women at a baby shower 2 years earlier, in substance, if not in identical language. That June's existence represented a situation arranged by a woman who had seen an opportunity. That Marcus had been maneuvered. That the family had concerns about the influence of his wife on the family's dynamics. Robert Marsh, because he is a thorough professional, documented this conversation in his assessment notes. Robert Marsh, because professional networks in the Chicago child welfare community are smaller than most people outside them realize, was a colleague of mine from a training I had attended 3 years earlier. He called me. He said, "Simone, I need to tell you something, and I need to tell you in my professional capacity rather than as someone who knows you personally, because what I am about to say has professional implications for something I am working on, and I want to be completely transparent with you about why I am making this call." He told me what Patricia had said. He told me that it was documented in his assessment notes. He told me that as a guardian ad litem, He was obligated to consider any information about family dynamics that might be relevant to the children's welfare, and that Patricia's statements about the family dynamics in Marcus's household were, in his professional judgment, potentially relevant to the question of how stable and supportive the extended family environment was for Diane's children during the transition they were navigating. He said, "I'm not telling you this to involve you in the proceedings. I'm telling you because I believe you have a right to know that these statements have been made and documented in a formal professional context, and because I think there may be things you want to do about that in your own life that are separate from what I'm doing in mine." I thanked him. I called Marcus. The conversation I had with Marcus after Robert Marsh's call was the most important conversation of our marriage. More important than anything we had said at the baby shower, and more important than the conversations of the first years of June's life. It was the conversation where I finally said, completely and without the specific careful management I had applied to every previous conversation about his mother, everything that I understood and had been patient about and had chosen not to say because the time had not been right. I said, "Your mother told a court-appointed guardian ad litem that our daughter was arranged rather than planned. She said it in the context of a formal assessment that is going to be filed with the family court." Those words are now in a court document, Marcus. They are no longer just words she said at a baby shower to 41 women who absorbed them and moved on. They are in a document that a judge is going to read. I said, "I need you to understand that I have been patient for 3 years. I have been consistent. I have done everything I understood how to do to build a genuine relationship with your mother rather than a managed detente. And I have done it because I believe that is the right approach, and because I love you and I understand that she is your mother, and that love does not simply recalibrate because its object has done something wrong." I said, "But I need you to also understand that I am a clinical social worker, and I have spent 12 years working with the family court system, and I understand exactly what it means when words like the ones your mother said appear in a guardian ad litem's assessment notes, and I need you to decide, right now, not eventually, right now, whether you are going to address this fully and directly with your mother, or whether I am going to need to understand something different about what my position in this family actually is." Marcus was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "What do you need me to do?" I said, "I need you to have the conversation with your mother that you have been finding reasons not to have for 3 years. Not a warning, not a management of her behavior. The actual conversation where you tell her the full truth about what her belief about our marriage has cost us, and what it has cost you, and what it is now doing in a formal legal context that neither of us chose." He said, "What if she can't hear it?" I said, "Then that is information we need to have about where things actually stand, but I need you to try, fully, not partially." He said, "I'll do it." He did it. I was not present for the conversation. Marcus drove to Deerfield the following Saturday morning, and he and his mother sat in the kitchen where Patricia had made Sunday dinners for 30 years. And Marcus told her, he told me afterward, more than he had ever told her in any previous conversation about any subject across his entire adult life. He told her what the baby shower had cost him, the specific internal fracture it had produced, the particular grief of watching the woman he loved sit in a decorated chair and hear herself described as a manipulator by his mother in front of everyone she had invited to share something important. He told her what her continued belief in her own narrative had cost his marriage across 3 years of patience he had not adequately acknowledged or protected. He told her about Robert Marsh and the guardian ad litem notes, and what it meant that her private belief had become a formal documented statement in a family court proceeding. He told her that he needed her to understand something completely and finally, that his marriage to me was the best decision he had made in his adult life, that June was a child who had been wanted and planned for and was loved completely, and that any version of his life that required him to maintain his relationship with his mother at the cost of the truth about his marriage and his daughter was a version he was not willing to inhabit any longer. He told me afterward that Patricia had cried. not the performed tears of someone managing a situation, the specific tears of someone who has encountered, finally and completely, the full cost of what they have believed and maintained and said, and who cannot, in that moment, find any of the usual defenses against the weight of it. She said, "I was afraid of losing him." Marcus said, "You were losing him. You have been losing him for 3 years, and I needed you to know that before it was too late to stop." I want to tell you about December now, because it has been waiting at the beginning of this story since I first told you it was coming, and you deserve to know what it actually was. The family court hearing in December was the final hearing in Diane and Jeff's custody proceeding. It was not a dramatic hearing. It was the specific procedural conclusion of a process that had been running for 10 months, at which the guardian ad litem presented his recommendations and the judge considered them alongside the other factors the court weighs in custody determinations. I was there because Robert Marsh had asked me to provide a professional character reference, not in my capacity as Marcus's wife, but in my capacity as a licensed clinical social worker with 12 years of child welfare experience, whose professional assessment of the family's strengths and challenges could be useful to the court's determination. This was an unusual but not unprecedented role, and both sides' attorneys had agreed to it after reviewing my professional credentials. Patricia was there because she was Diane's primary childcare support during the separation, and her involvement with the children was part of what the court was evaluating. We had not been in the same room since the kitchen conversation in Deerfield 6 weeks earlier, which Marcus had described to me in detail, and which had, in the intervening weeks, produced something I had not entirely anticipated. 3 phone calls between Patricia and me, initiated by her, the specific reaching out of someone who has had a reckoning and is trying, imperfectly and with uncertain success, to find their way to something different. The calls had been difficult and genuine in roughly equal measure. Patricia was not suddenly a different person. She was a 66-year-old woman who had spent her entire adult life organizing her emotional world around a framework that had just been comprehensively challenged, and reorganizing an emotional world at 66 is slower and more uncertain than it might be at a younger age, and the reorganization was visible in the specific, careful quality of everything she said during those 3 calls. I listened to her. I said what was true. I did not perform warmth I did not yet fully feel. I was genuinely myself, the way I had decided to be genuinely myself from the beginning, and the genuine self I was with Patricia in those 3 calls was someone who was still processing 3 years of what her belief had cost me, and who was also someone who understood, from 12 years of clinical work, that people who are genuinely trying to change deserve to have that effort met with something more than permanent distrust. The courtroom in December was a standard Cook County courtroom, the specific functional austerity of family court. Nothing dramatic about the room itself. Fluorescent lights and wooden benches and the particular institutional smell of a building that processes human suffering and human resolution in roughly equal measure every day. Patricia was already seated when I came in. She saw me, and the expression on her face when she saw me walk in was not what I had expected, and was not something I have been able to fully describe to anyone since. It was recognition. Not the recognition of seeing a familiar face. The specific recognition of someone who has spent 3 years believing one thing, and 6 weeks beginning to understand something different, encountering, in a formal public context, the actual person they have been misunderstanding, and seeing that person clearly, perhaps for the first time, as exactly what she was: a licensed professional, a mother, a woman who had spent 12 years working in the specific system this courtroom was part of, and who was here today because a court-appointed professional had asked for her expertise. I sat down at the table. I organized my materials. I did not look at Patricia again immediately, not from deliberate avoidance, but from the specific professional focus of someone who has a task to perform and is going to perform it well. Robert Marsh presented his assessment. The judge asked questions. I provided the professional perspective I had been asked to provide, specifically and clearly, drawing on 12 years of direct experience in exactly the kind of family situation the court was evaluating. The judge, at one point, asked me a question that I want to record precisely because I think it matters. He said, "Miss Holloway, in your professional experience, what is the most important factor in determining whether an extended family support system is genuinely beneficial to children navigating parental separation?" I said, "In my experience, the most important factor is whether the adults in the extended family system are able to prioritize the children's actual needs over their own emotional needs in moments of stress. Extended family support is beneficial when the adults involved have the self-awareness to recognize when their own fears or preferences are shaping their behavior in ways that cost the children clarity and security. Extended family support is harmful when those adults cannot make that distinction." The judge nodded. He made a note. I did not look at Patricia when I said this. I did not need to. The answer was true as professional testimony, and it was true as everything else. And I had learned, across 3 years of patience and 1 baby shower, and 6 weeks of phone calls and this specific December morning, that the truth does not require theatrical delivery. It simply requires saying. After the hearing, in the corridor outside the courtroom, Patricia came up to me. I want to describe this moment carefully because I think it is the most important moment of the entire story, and because I want to be honest about what it was and what it was not. She did not apologize in the specific formal way that apologies are sometimes delivered, the structured recitation of acknowledgement and regret that can sometimes feel more like a performance of contrition than contrition itself. What she did was stand in the corridor and look at me for a moment, and then say, in a voice that had none of the composed delivery of the woman who had stood near the window at my baby shower, "I have been wrong about you for a long time. I want you to know that I understand that now. Not because Marcus told me. Because I have been paying attention, finally, and what I have been seeing is not what I believed I would see." I said, "I know." She said, "I don't know if I can fix what I've done." I said, "I don't know either. But I think trying is different from not trying." She said, "June, I want to be the grandmother she deserves, not the grandmother I've been being." I said, "That's not a decision I make alone. That's a decision Marcus and I make together. But I will tell you this. I have never, across 3 years of your believing the worst of me, stopped hoping that we would eventually arrive at something more honest than what we had." That is not a small thing. She looked at me. She said, "No, it's not." We walked out of the courthouse in the specific December cold of a Chicago winter, into the specific bright cold light of a day that had nothing particular to recommend it, except that it was real, and it was the day we were in, and it was, in its specific ordinary realness, better than what had preceded it. I want to tell you where things stand now, because I think the honest current state matters more than any tidied resolution. June is 3 years old. She has her father's dark eyes and my specific laugh, which my mother says I got from her mother, which means it has traveled at least 3 generations and is, therefore, in some specific way, older than any of the complications this story contains. She attends a Montessori program 3 mornings a week and has opinions about her socks that she expresses with complete conviction and no self-doubt whatsoever, a quality I hope she carries into adulthood. Patricia sees June once a month, sometimes twice. The visits are careful, in the specific way of a relationship that is being rebuilt rather than simply continued, where the people involved are paying more attention than they paid before, because they understand now what inattention cost them. She brings June books, specific books chosen with genuine thought, and she sits on the floor with her granddaughter and reads them with the full focused attention of someone who has understood, finally, what showing up actually requires. She and I are not close. I want to be honest about this because I think claiming a resolution I have not actually reached would be a specific kind of dishonesty that this story does not deserve. We are working toward something. The working is real, and the something is still uncertain, and I believe that is as accurate a description of where we are as I can offer. Marcus and I celebrated our 4th anniversary in October. We went to dinner at a restaurant we had been to on our 2nd date, the specific sentimental return that anniversaries sometimes make possible, and we talked about the 3 years that had passed and what they had cost us and what they had, unexpectedly, also given us, which was a specific tested clarity about each other and about our marriage that easier years might not have produced. He said, at dinner, something I want to share because I think it is true, and because I think truth is what this story has always been about. He said, I spent most of my adult life being a smaller version of myself than I actually was. I didn't know that was happening. I thought I was just being considerate, being a good son, managing things carefully so everyone stayed comfortable. I didn't understand that the comfort was costing me something I didn't know I was losing until I almost lost it completely. I said, what changed? He said, you stayed. You stayed being exactly who you are when it would have been much easier to become someone else or to leave. And eventually I could see myself in the reflection of someone who was genuinely seeing me, and what I saw was different from what I'd been told I was. I said, I stayed because you were worth staying for. He said, I know. That's what I'm thanking you for. Here is what 3 years inside a situation that required more patience than I sometimes had available taught me. I know that the decision to respond to someone's worst behavior with consistency rather than escalation is not passivity. It is a specific active choice that requires more discipline than confrontation does, and that produces, over sufficient time, a different kind of result than confrontation can produce. Confrontation addresses a specific moment. Consistency addresses a pattern, and patterns are what actually determine the long-term shape of relationships. I know that the people who believe the worst things about you are almost never doing so because of who you actually are. They are doing so because of who they are afraid of, what they are afraid of losing, what they have never fully examined about their own relationship to the person they believe you threaten. Understanding this does not make the behavior hurt less, but it makes the behavior legible in a way that allows you to respond to what is actually happening rather than to what is being performed. I know that 12 years of clinical social work shaped how I navigated this situation in ways I could not have anticipated when I chose that profession, and that there is a specific, strange comfort in the recognition that the skills you build in service of other people's hardest moments are also the skills that will carry you through your own. And I know that June Dorothy Holloway, 3 years old, with her father's eyes and her great-grandmother's laugh, does not know and will not know for many years that her first major life event, her arrival at a baby shower her aunt spent 6 weeks planning, was accompanied by a woman standing up near the window and saying something that would take 3 years to fully respond to. She will know when she is old enough to know it, that her parents stayed and worked and built something honest from what was genuinely difficult, and that her grandmother eventually became someone different in the specific slow way that people sometimes do when they finally stop being afraid of what they might find if they look clearly. That is my story. A baby shower and a decorated chair, and a woman near the window who said something that required 3 years to answer completely, and a courtroom in December, and a corridor, and the specific ordinary December cold of a day that was better, in its plainness, than everything that had led to it. If this reminded you of something you responded to with patience when everyone around you expected a fight, I want to hear from you. Drop it in the comments. Share this with someone who needs to know that staying genuinely yourself in the face of someone else's fear is one of the most difficult and most important things a person can do. Hit subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.